It is May 8, 1945. The Soviet Union has just fully captured Berlin. The smoke from the last battles is slowly dissipating. The once proud capital of the Reich lies in ruins, and over the destroyed Reichstag, the triumphant red Soviet flag now flutters. This marks the end of the darkest chapter in German history, but at the same time, it is the beginning of a new era, one marked by uncertainty, mistrust, and the onset of the Cold War. In the weeks following the capture of Berlin, as the victory celebrations faded and the reality of the post-war order set in, Soviet leaders faced a strategic decision of far-reaching significance. Despite deep differences with the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, the Soviet Union decided to leave West Berlin to the Western Allies. This step, which may seem puzzling at first glance, was the result of a complex mix of pragmatic considerations and long-term strategic calculation. But this decision would soon escalate into a bitter clash of ideologies, and the division of the German capital would become one of the most potent symbols of the Cold War. Why, then, did the Soviet Union hand over half of Berlin to the Western Allies? What strategic calculations were behind this decision? And why did it bring Berlin to the brink? All these fascinating questions will be explored in today's video. Enjoy! By the beginning of 1945, the Soviet Union had conquered much of Eastern Europe. Then came what was perhaps Stalin's most crucial offensive, the March on Berlin. Joseph Stalin had already set his sights early on capturing the German capital as the top priority. There were several reasons for this. First, the city was not only the political center of the Nazi regime, but it also symbolized Hitler's imperial ambitions, everything Stalin despised. Furthermore, by eliminating the German capital, the war could be ended as quickly as possible. But there was another reason, extending beyond the war itself, that played a significant role. Even during the war, Allied conferences revealed a growing rift between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. As victory over Germany became increasingly certain, all the major powers began positioning themselves for the post-war period. On the battlefield, this meant claiming as much territory as possible within one's sphere of influence to have ample bargaining power during the subsequent peace negotiations. The capital of Hitler's regime, of course, was an especially valuable prize. Thus, a race for Berlin developed near the end of the war between the Americans and British on one side and the Soviets on the other. Stalin was particularly concerned that the Western Allies might make separate agreements that could undermine Soviet interests in Europe. Controlling Berlin, he believed, would allow him greater leverage over all future decisions. This also explains why he pushed forward millions of soldiers toward Berlin, without pause and with little regard for losses. His strategy succeeded, and he was able to close in on Berlin rapidly. The Soviet forces launched their final offensive in late April 1945. They had to break through several well-fortified German defensive lines, including the Seelow Heights, which saw one of the largest artillery battles of the war. Despite fierce German resistance, the Soviet troops broke through and encircled Berlin. They had reached the capital ahead of the Western Allies, and with Berlin now cut off from supplies, Stalin had almost achieved his goal. Intense street fighting followed, with the Red Army battling desperate and often improvised German defense units, including the Volkssturm militia. But Berlin's fate was sealed. On May 2, 1945, the German garrison in Berlin surrendered, and Karlshorst, a suburb of Berlin, became the site of the official surrender ceremony on May 8, 1945, marking the end of World War II. In Europe, Stalin could now present himself as the great victor, and the German capital was entirely in his hands. The Western Allies were also overjoyed by the victory, but their celebrations were dampened by the emergence of a new conflict, the Cold War. The stark differences between the systems became apparent quickly. and many U.S. officials feared that the Soviet Union would further expand its influence. The main victorious powers met for the first time after the war at the Potsdam Conference to establish the post-war order. Held from July 7th to August 2nd, 1945, it brought together Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Harry S. Truman. France, however, was not involved in the talks, even though it later became an occupying power. Here, compared to previous wartime Allied conferences, deep mistrust was evident. Many American negotiators feared that Stalin would never relinquish Berlin. For Stalin, however, the German capital was primarily a bargaining chip to achieve his broader goals. He knew how important it was, especially for the Americans, to have influence in Berlin as well. Using this leverage, Stalin was able to extract numerous concessions, including the westward expansion of Soviet and Polish borders, control over Kaliningrad, and Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. Of course, Berlin was not Stalin's only bargaining chip, but it played a crucial role. In return, he agreed to divide Berlin and the entirety of Germany into 4 occupation zones. Stalin also calculated that conflicts might arise within the Western occupation zones, from which the Soviet Union could ultimately benefit. But in this regard, he was mistaken. By 1947, the American and British zones had merged to form the Bizone, creating a unified economic area. The French zone later joined, forming the Trizone. Berlin was now divided into just 2 zones, West Berlin and East Berlin. To Stalin's frustration, this led to one of the first major international crises of the Cold War. In June 1948, the Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in their zones and in West Berlin. This currency reform laid the foundation for the Marshall Plan, which aimed to rebuild Germany rapidly. The Soviet Union saw this currency reform as a unilateral move that could economically unite Germany and strengthen the western parts of the country, as well as West Berlin. At the heart of the dispute were 2 competing visions for post-war Germany. The Western powers sought a democratic and economically stable Germany, integrated into the European Reconstruction Program and contributing to European unification. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, wanted a weak Germany under Soviet influence that could no longer pose a threat. Capitalism and communism clashed here as starkly as ever, leading to a stalemate in further Allied negotiations over Germany's future. For Berlin, things worsened. Deep within the Soviet zone, West Berlin was surrounded on all sides by Soviet territory. To ensure proper administration, the Western Allies had been granted land and water corridors at the Potsdam Conference. But Stalin now blocked these routes, cutting off Berlin from the outside world. Once again, he used Berlin as leverage. The blockade was intended to force the Western Allies to reverse the currency reform and renegotiate Germany's and Berlin's future. But this time, Stalin would fail. The US and the UK were more determined than ever to oppose Stalin. They organized an immense airlift to supply the approximately 2.5 million residents of West Berlin with food, coal, and other necessities. The operation posed enormous logistical challenges. At the height of the airlift in the spring of 1949, a plane landed at one of West Berlin's airports approximately every 90 seconds. Despite difficult weather conditions, technical challenges, and the constant threat of Soviet aircraft, the Allies managed to supply West Berlin continuously for nearly a year. The airlift became a symbol of resistance against the Soviet blockade, and the Western Allies were more united than ever. Stalin eventually recognized this and ended the blockade on May 12, 1949, realizing that his plan to use Berlin as leverage had failed. However, the blockade deepened the division between East and West and contributed to the formal partition of Germany. Just months later, the Federal Republic of Germany was established in the West, followed by the creation of the German Democratic Republic in the east. Berlin remained divided, and tensions over the city remained a focal point of the Cold War.